Yeah, yes, I'm here, so I think you're.
So glad you're here. I'm just like, okay. Oh yeah.
Okay, I think we'll get started. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for sacrificing the sunny weather to come join us on what we hope will be a very engaging and educational evening. My name is Paul Reville. I'm the Francis Keppel Professor of the Practice of Policy and Administration at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I direct the Education Redesign Lab here. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's Askwith Forum, and in particular I want to extend a welcome to those who are joining us via live stream online. We're happy to have you with us and look forward to your participating in this. I would also like to extend a special warm welcome to the HGSE Rural Educators Student Group, and we have with us Stacy Cummins and Kathleen Jarman, who have led that group, and that group's efforts in terms of organizing for our school to provide a greater focus on this issue has been extremely helpful to us in planning this event this evening, so we're grateful for that. Our Askwith Forums, as most of you know because you've participated in the past, are opportunities to engage with issues that are of current interest and often controversy in the field of education, and to include not only our community within the walls of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, but outside. And if you're interested in Askwith Forums and more information about them and upcoming events, please feel free to visit our website. This evening we're gathered to talk about rural America and issues of education, innovation, and promise. Rural America has undergone many changes in the past century and a half, really. Our country has shifted from a primarily agricultural economy in a pre-industrial revolution where rural areas thrived, and now we're in a current, primarily urban, post-industrial, information and service-based economy. As Paul Krugman of the New York Times wrote recently, quote, as recently as the 1950s, rural America was, quote, a major part of the demographic, social, and cultural landscape. Since then, however, while America's population has doubled, the number of farmers has fallen by 2/3. Unquote. Rural America has suffered from neglect, not only from policymakers, but from academia. In many circles, the overarching narrative about rural America has been static. With the election of 2016, interest in rural America has been rekindled, but the narrative is largely negative and stereotypical. One of a dying, white, non-college educated, low-skilled America being left behind by the 21st century economy. Obviously, it's not that simple. Just recently, we witnessed two divergent views dueling in the New York Times op-ed page, published just 2 days apart by Paul Krugman and David Brooks. Krugman writes, not that long ago, we used to think of social collapse as an inner-city problem. Nowadays, phenomena like the prevalence of jobless men in their prime working years, or worse yet, the surge in deaths of despair by drugs, alcohol, or suicide, are concentrated in declining rural areas. His prognosis for rural America is bleak. While David Brooks contends everybody says rural America is collapsing, but I keep going to places with moral coherence and social commitment, more moral coherence and social commitment than we have in booming urban areas, unquote. He continues, the word I heard most commonly was intentionality, especially about community. Many people try not to use Amazon so they can support local businesses. They don't use the self-checkout lines in the drugstore so they can support local workers, unquote. Brooks is asset-oriented and optimistic. Speaking of static, our education system, too, has remained largely faithful to its early 20th century factory model origins. We have a one-size-fits-all approach that we continue to apply to our incredibly diverse array of students. And it isn't working. At the Education Redesign Lab, we are seeking to shift our mindsets and practices to support each and every child, to meet children where they are and give them what they need in order to be successful. This approach should apply to rural America's children as well. Much has changed in the realities of rural America, but our ways of thinking about our fellow Americans and how we educate children in these areas has not. It's time to do better, and we as educators need to play an important role. How? That's what we'll explore in the conversation this evening. The purpose of our forum is to discuss the promise of rural America while considering best practices and bright spots for raising up children and youth through an integrated, holistic system of education, support, and opportunities. Fortunately for all of us, we have a distinguished panel of 4 people, including 2 proud HGSE graduates, with us to explore these topics. So I'm going to take a moment and introduce our 4 panelists. First, we have Sanford Johnson, who is sitting second to your right, looking to the stage. Sanford is co-founder and deputy director of Mississippi First, an education policy organization based in Jackson. He has been involved in education in the Mississippi Delta for 15 years. He is a Mississippi native who returned to the state as a 2003 Delta Corps member of Teach for America. He taught secondary social studies at Coahoma County High School in Clarksdale. Whoop, here are a few snaps for that. And KIPP Delta College Prep in Helena, Arkansas. And even more there. This is getting snappy, Sanford. You got a lot of support here. Sanford earned a bachelor's from Auburn University and a master's from the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service. Our own Thomas Kane, to your far right, is an economist and Walter H. Gale Professor of Education here at HGSE. He is faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research, a university-wide research center that works with school districts and state agencies. He is also principal investigator of the newly launched National Center for Rural Education Research Networks at Harvard. Between 2009 and 12, Tom directed the Measures of Effective Teaching project for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. His work has spanned both K-12 and higher education, covering topics such as the design of school accountability systems, teacher recruitment and retention, financial aid for college, race-conscious college admissions, and the earnings impacts of community colleges. Tom earned his bachelor's summa cum laude from the University of Notre Dame, a master's in economics from Michigan, and his doctorate in public policy from Harvard. Geoff Marietta is with us to my immediate left. Geoff is an entrepreneur, educator, and author working in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky. He is currently entrepreneur in residence at the University of the Cumberlands. Prior to his appointment, Geoff led the successful turnaround of Pine Mountain Settlement School, an 800-acre National Historic Landmark community nonprofit in rural eastern Kentucky, working at the intersection of economic development and education. Geoff is also the founder of Mountain Tech Media, a digital media company based in eastern Kentucky, and Trillium Ventures, a community development real estate company that invests and restores historic Main Street buildings in the region. He earned his bachelor's at the University of Montana, an MBA from Harvard Business School, and a doctorate here at HGSE. And finally, Mara Teakin. Mara is Associate Professor of Education at Bates College. Her research focuses on racial and educational equity in rural schools and communities. Her book, Why Rural Schools Matter, University of North Carolina Press, examines how rural schools define and sustain their surrounding communities, and her research has appeared in many journals, including the American Education Research Journal, Harvard Educational Review, and Peabody Journal of Education. Mara is currently working on a multi-year project supported by the Spencer Foundation that explores the college experiences of rural first-generation students. She also works with the Center for Youth and Community Leadership and Education, where she supports organizing efforts in rural New England. Mara taught elementary school in rural Tennessee after college and earned her bachelor's at Dartmouth College and her doctorate from HGSE. So that's our panel, and you can see why we're so enthusiastic to have them with us. Our format for the evening is going to be a panel conversation. We have invited each of our panelists, and we'll go from Geoff off to his left across the panel to make opening statements at 3 or 4 minutes in length to just cover what they think is important in this field. And then we're going to engage in a conversation which I'll lead. We'll tee up several what we hope will be relevant questions, and then toward the end of our time together, we'll open it up to you in the audience. There are microphones in both aisles, and we invite you to ask questions, the underlying questions, in the course of the evening. So it should be a great conversation, and without any further ado, Geoff, we'll ask you to take it away.
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me and inviting me here. I never thought that I'd ever sit on an Askwith panel. I mean, this is quite the honor. I grew up in a rural mining community. I was born and raised in Hibbing, Minnesota, up on the Iron Range, and taught in rural Navajo Nation. And then the first time I ever lived in a city was when I came to Harvard Business School, and that was quite the experience. I now live in the worst place in America to live, according to the New York Times and the USA Today most recently. But I'm not too worried about it because that's just fake news. I now live in eastern Kentucky, and thank you for the introduction. Pine Mountain Settlement School, which is a community nonprofit, really is a microcosm of what I think a thriving and sustainable rural economy and educational system can look like. We not only create a pipeline for local community people to pursue opportunities at the end of their education, but we also create those opportunities in growing sectors in the rural economy, which a lot of it's going to be in outdoor recreation, tourism, technology, healthcare. So that experience, I think, really opened my eyes up to what do we need to be doing in rural America, which I think that the government and the corporate sector has just ignored, and I would even use the word oppressed, over the last 5 decades as the economy has shifted from a primarily manufacturing and resource extractive industries to the service economy. And now we're at a crisis, surprise, surprise. And we only woke up because of 2016. And I just want to make one comment on that. The distribution of rational, intelligent people in rural America is the same here as it is in Cambridge. And I can tell you that the people there know how the government works a lot better than people in Cambridge do. And that is just, an opener in saying these are not dumb, ignorant people. They're actually smart, and maybe they're trying to send America a wake-up call that they're struggling, and guess what, suburban and metro America, you're next. So we need to start investing in education and economic opportunity at the same time in rural America.
Thank you, Geoff. Mara.
Thanks. Like Geoff said, it's great to be here, and I never really imagined that I would be on an Askwith panel on this side of things. So it's really good to be here. Thank you. As Paul mentioned, I began as a rural teacher, and it was as a teacher that I began to realize how missing rural education was from all our debates about policy making and practice. So I made my way here to Hugsy, and now I study rural education, mostly in the rural Delta and in rural New England. I do qualitative work. I had the good fortune of studying with Dr. Lawrence Litfoot while I was a student here, and so I do portraiture. And through my work, I really try to center rural voices. So things have changed since I was a teacher. Now people are actually talking about rural, as Geoff also alluded to. But I think there's a number of flaws in our national narrative about rural communities, and so I wanted to use my time right now to just name a couple of those flaws. So the first is that rural America is white America. This myth has been out there a while. If you think about Mayberry and the Andy Griffith Show or the movie Deliverance, it was white folks, right, in those particular portrayals of rural America. But this myth has gained kind of new popularity and new power in the wake of the 2016 election. The truth is, people of color make up about 20% of the rural population, and of that 10.3 million people, about 40% are African American, 35% are non-white Hispanic, and the remaining 25% are Native American, Asian or Asian Pacific Islander, or multiracial. And importantly, that population is growing. So from 2000 to 2010, the rural non-white population grew by about 20%, while the rural white population remained essentially flat. So this growth is really good news because it's offsetting some of the population decline we are seeing among the rural white population in some places, and it's also bringing new human capital, new resources, new ideas. So this is what's going to keep rural America growing and thriving. So this myth is inaccurate, but it's also dangerous because what it does is if rural America is all white, there can't possibly be racial inequality within it then, and there can't be policies and practices that perpetuate that kind of racial inequality. So what this myth does is it kind of masks that, and it keeps us then from addressing it. So we need to be having this more accurate conversation about who really lives in rural America. So that's the first myth. And then the second myth I want to mention is the myth that rural America is dying. And I see three things that are problematic here. First, there are a number of rural industries that are actually doing quite well. Things like rural tourism, economies catering to rural retirees, the organic farming movement. So some rural industries are doing just fine. The second thing that I think that is problematic with this particular myth is that it tends to conflate industries with communities. So there certainly are some rural industries that are really struggling right now, and it's creating all kinds of challenges for the folks that live in those communities. But the communities themselves are not necessarily dying. They're still filled with, vibrant relationships, cultures, deep ties to place. And what this myth does is it tends to overlook or dismiss the communities that are living in those places. And then the third issue that I have with this particular narrative is that if you are going to use the word dying to describe some rural industries, let's at least get the metaphor right. Dying kind of connotes like a passive, natural sort of death. But we're actually killing rural America, and we're doing it through economic and environmental exploitation, which is concentrating wealth in the hands of a few, usually people who don't live there, and through bad policy making, which is doing things like closing rural schools and eroding rural infrastructures. So this myth is inaccurate, it's imprecise, and it really masks the role that corporations and policies are playing in the kind of economic decline we're seeing in some rural places. So we desperately need a more accurate, nuanced conversation about rural places, and I'm excited to be able to hopefully have a bit of that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara. Sanford. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I hail from the great state of Mississippi. Got the pen here. Also coming from Clarksdale. I think Clarksdale is represented in the House somewhere. I am going to warn you, I'm going to try to recruit all of you to come to the state of Mississippi because that's what I do. I started off back in 1998, graduating from high school and thinking that I was never coming back to the state of Mississippi. I'm going to go off to college somewhere else. I'm going to live in D.C., in Prince George's County with all my relatives, and that's where my life is going to be. Ended up working doing an internship the summer before I graduated, connected with a hometown friend of mine who was also going to be in Jackson that summer. Next thing you know, I'm all about Mississippi and all things Mississippi. What do I need to do to work on education, on policy issues in Mississippi? Thought that was going to take me to Capitol Hill where I could work for a senator and work on education, work on Mississippi issues. And I found out about Teach for America. I thought, okay, well, let me be in the Delta. Let me do the work there. Then at that point, I was thinking, okay, 2 years in the Delta, then I can go to D.C. 15 years later, a house, a wife, family. I'm still in the Delta and loving every single minute of it. So that is the beginning of my pitch. So remember, I'm going to try to recruit you all. We deal with a lot of the same issues that a lot of rural places deal with. Trying to figure out how can we get more talent to lead our schools, our classrooms, our districts. We also deal with the challenge of how to allocate resources in a way to make sure that every single child gets what they need in order to get an excellent education. We also deal with the challenge of trying to look at trending educational reform efforts and try to figure out how to translate them into something that will be viable in a rural place. thinking about like the school improvement grants, for example, and one of the options was you can do a school turnaround where you fire the principal and get rid of half the staff. How do you do that in a rural place where you already see declining teachers? And then when you think about, well, the principal is related to that teacher and goes to church with that teacher and their frat brothers, like how do you actually do a turnaround here? Sometimes we have to look at a reform effort and just think about how can we do this in Mississippi? How can we do this in the Delta? How many charter schools are we really going to have in the Mississippi Delta? Can a black child actually take a voucher and go to a segregated private academy? So these are some of the things that we're thinking about. One thing that makes us unique from other rural places is that we are trying to figure out how to build an education system that serves everyone on the ruins of an education system that was designed by Jim Crow. So how do we make that transition and create an education system that works for everybody? There's been a lot of work that we've been able to do over the last 10 years working in education policy. We've increased access to pre-K. We have created a charter sector based on the lessons learned from other states. We are also doing work around the teacher pipeline, looking at testing policies. So there's a lot of work there. So I don't want anybody to think that the Delta is hopeless. It's very challenging. Like there's a lot of challenging work, but it's far from hopeless. So what I'm hoping is that I can recruit you to come to the Delta. But like for an individual, I want you to come and be ready to be a teammate. And I don't want you to think that you're going to be a savior. For research organizations, I want you to really think about what's happening in the Delta before you start talking about ideas, like really understand this place. And I'm hoping for foundations across the country. I'm hoping that people will invest more money and invest more resources in the Delta, but do it to expand the capacity of local people as opposed to just dropping off money or dropping off programs and then leaving. So that's the first of many recruitment pitches that I'm going to make to you. And I'm just very happy to be here and be a part of this conversation.
Happy to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom.
So thanks, everybody, for coming out on such a beautiful day outside. It'll still be beautiful at 7 o'clock. Yes. School districts, you know, the very organizations that we entrust to help our students learn how to learn are terrible at learning themselves. Because as anybody who's ever tried to put together a piece of furniture from IKEA or tried to build a tree house or tried to write a computer program has learned is that our first ideas about how things are going to work are never right or rarely right. And that the way organizations learn is by piloting things in a small way, seeing whether they work, and then scaling up the things that don't work. Now, even though all school districts, rural or urban, or most school districts, rural or urban, struggle with learning, it's particularly difficult for rural districts. One reason is just, if the average size of a rural district is, 1,100 students, then hiring a full-time staff member to do the analysis costs about $100 per student just to hire one person. That's a very expensive thing. A second reason, though, is even if a rural district were able to hire somebody to help analyze its data, they don't have the sample size to do the piloting and testing that's required to figure out whether something's working. So, for instance, just to discern whether a particular math curriculum or teacher PD is producing a modest improvement in math achievement requires about 1,200 students, like 600 students in treatment and 600 in the comparison. And most rural school districts just don't have that number of students within their districts to do that kind of testing. And a third reason why it's really hard for rural districts to learn is that the federal government, which invests most of the money in education research, does very little that is particularly relevant to the challenges that rural schools are facing. So we just received this grant from the federal government, and our hope is to be a teammate with a set of rural schools in the state of New York and in the state of Ohio. We'll be working with 30 districts in each state, and our role will just be to help do the data analytics, to do the data convening, and help these districts pilot and test ways to try to improve student outcomes. So we're starting with a problem with student absenteeism. We're then going to move to college readiness. A lot of the rural schools struggle with just providing access to AP courses. So we're going to be working with them to see are there things that they can do to help students make the transition, prepare for, and then make the transition to college. But once we've sort of developed this model with New York and Ohio, we hope that we can then take that to other states, because New York and Ohio aren't the only two states that have failed to help rural schools, learn from their data. And so basically we see ourselves as providing the means for rural communities to be able to adapt to the challenges they face and to be able to pilot and test solutions to the challenges, because right now they lack the capacity to be able to do that in any kind of systematic way. And if they don't do it in a systematic way, there's a great danger that they're just going to draw the wrong conclusions about what's working and what's not.
Great. Thank you, Tom. Thank you all, panelists, for your opening comments. Mara, I'd like to ask you to help get us started just in this kind of framing the conversation a little bit. When we talk about rural, what is the definition of rural, or what is a working definition in your mind, and do different people feel differently about this, and does it matter?
Great question. There's not an easy answer to that question. So if we think about definitions, the federal government uses more than 15 different definitions of rural, and then each state has their own definitions of rural. I was recently reading something, the state of Texas has like more than 200 definitions of rural. So there is a lot of definitional confusion about what rural actually is. Most of these definitions tend to be tied to things like land use, population size, population density, distance to an urban area. Most of them also rely on some kind of core distinction between either rural and urban, or metropolitan and non-metropolitan. In my mind, there's a number of issues here with all of this. One is there are so many different definitions, and so if you're trying to do research, it really becomes difficult to figure out, which of these definitions do we use, which do we go with. Also, many places end up being rural by some definitions and urban by other definitions. So you get a lot of places that are kind of in between. And then I think probably the biggest issue is that by most of these definitions, rural is a leftover category. So we define urban, we define metropolitan, and then rural or non-metropolitan kind of ends up being this grab bag of everything left. So the term rural masks a lot of variation and diversity within and across rural communities. Kind of for a working definition here, a lot of these definitions put the rural population at about 20% of the U.S. population. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, about 9 million about 1/5 of our children, or 9 million children, are educated in public rural schools. For my own work, I do qualitative work, so I've got the luxury of asking people how they self-identify. And so for myself, that's usually the definition I go with.
All right, well, let's maybe use your generic working definition of the 20% as we think about this and talk about this tonight. Okay, again, starting at some distance from the challenge of education, just want to ask our panel to weigh in on what you think are the biggest sort of challenges and opportunities with respect to restoring economic viability and social mobility to rural communities. This is sort of big picture, sort of top level stuff. We're going to get more specific as we go on.
I would jump in and say that access to broadband is something that could be a potential game changer in Mississippi. Our legislature recently passed legislation that will allow for our rural electric power companies to start providing broadband service. This is very, very new, and I know that there are some power companies that are looking into this right now. There are some that are not, and probably going to need a local push in order to provide that. That could be a great opportunity in a lot of different ways. One, I think that it would bring better access to online learning for some schools, as long as there's still a focus on making sure that there are teachers in the room that can provide students with additional support if they need it. I think it could be an opportunity for more people to work remotely. That's what I do. Like, our offices for our nonprofit is based in Jackson. I work in Clarksdale. Like, thank you, Google, for everything. So I'm able to do that there, and there could be more opportunities to take advantage of that. Also in Clarksdale, of all places, we have a lot of virtual reality training that's taking place. There was a local guy that came in from California, started a program. There are a lot of young people. There's a charter school in Clarksdale that has a program. Our local library has one. There are conversations with our local community college about creating like a 2-year degree around virtual reality. So just thinking about all the possibilities that are right here in my community, and just thinking, like, what could this look like in other places?
Going back to your original comment, what percentage of the population, if you know, in Mississippi is not covered with broadband?
So I know that there are 60% of people who live in rural Mississippi, which is outside of Metro Jackson, Metro Memphis. Like 60% of folks who live in rural parts of Mississippi don't have access to broadband. Mm-hmm. And I know that it, like in the Delta, like it's a major issue. But then there are other parts of the state that don't have access either. So I'm hoping that all these electric power companies will take advantage of this.
Yeah, great. Others on just sort of top level economic development challenges, social mobility challenges, looking at the big factors, what comes to mind for any of you?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree on the technology and access to broadband. Same issues in Eastern Kentucky. No, cell service, broadband access is horrible. It's developing. I mean, I think it's actually worse than in many developing countries. I think we need to somehow create economic opportunities that provide living wage jobs with stable incomes that have access to quality health care. Mm-hmm. And that does not exist in Eastern Kentucky or Central Appalachia. And it doesn't exist because those jobs tend to require a college degree and tend to agglomerate, as a New York Times article recently said, around the coast and metropolitan areas. So we need to really be thinking creatively about creating jobs and economic opportunities and the training and education to those jobs and economic opportunities that are in growing sectors that pay those living wages in rural America. And I think, Mara talked about the myth that the economy is dying. I mean, we see in Eastern Kentucky some traction around tourism, outdoor recreation, local food. Really the authenticity of rural America is still there. I joke around, I say study abroad in Eastern Kentucky, because you're going to, Paris or London is the same as Boston. But let me tell you, come down to Harlan County and you're in for an entirely different cultural experience. There is not a Starbucks for 2.5 hours, which is a problem too. But I think that's what I see. It's kind of like you got to change the whole system.
Yeah, that Mara, that Krugman Brook debate sort of illustrates this challenge. And on the one hand, there's a point of view. Well, it's time to just close up rural America and skill people up and move them out. And on the other hand, there are a lot of folks who believe there are enormous assets there, and economic development is viable, and we can, given pulling the right levers, some of which have already been mentioned, bring people back to these communities and grow jobs. Where, and I know you're a believer in the asset model.
Absolutely.
What gives you hope?
Many things give me hope. I think, as Sanford mentioned, there is all kinds of really good work happening in rural places, and we need more people. I mean, there is a lot more attention right now to rural places. Philanthropies, policymakers are finally waking up and saying, wow, there's a whole big rural swath of our country here. And so I think what I am most hopeful about is people getting behind the good work that's already happening in rural places and being able to amplify that. And so, as Geoff mentioned, there are definitely some rural industries that are really growing right now. I think there's also some really creative solutions happening to thorny issues. So this broadband access issue, I was just reading about a school district that has outfitted its school buses with a really strong hotspot, so the wireless signal. And so then at the end of the school day, the buses go out, drop off the children, and then park out in the district. And so then that gives people access to wireless. So I think there's some really creative solutions like that are happening. I also think that another challenge is the diversity of rural America itself. Mm-hmm. So what's going to work in one place is not necessarily going to work in another place. Right. Another thing that Vermont is working on right now is $10,000 grants. If you're able to work remotely and you move to Vermont, there's a $10,000 grant to incentivize that. Of course, that requires really good broadband access. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be kind of coordinated policy making happening with education and economic policy, infrastructure. But I think there's some really cool things happening, and that's what continues to give me hope.
Great. Thank you, Tom.
So, Paul, just in terms of social mobility, though, one of the things that we're all familiar with is since 1980, there's been a huge rise in the difference in earnings between college graduates and high school graduates. Mostly because, the labor market has collapsed for high school graduates or people without a college degree. And the rural students in rural schools particularly struggle in making connections to higher education. And so policies and programs to improve the connections, so part of it is AP courses. Even just a net, only about 2/3 of rural high schools offer an AP course in one of the STEM subjects. It's more like 90% in the urban schools. So that's one thing. That's related to the just teaching capacity. Right. Can't hire a teacher in all the subjects that would be required, But it's also just social connections or social distance to four-year colleges or community colleges. Yeah. And so policies and programs in high schools that would help make it easier for kids to make that transition.
We're going to come back to the question of higher education, but let's go to education specifically now. I want to talk eventually about K-12. I'd be interested to hear about early childhood if anybody wants to touch on that topic. And eventually we're going to talk about adult education. But right now, thinking in the K-12 sphere, what are the biggest obstacles to educational success for students in the communities that you represent?
I would say two quick things. One, the teacher pipeline is one of our biggest issues. We don't have enough people that are going into education anymore. And the folks who do go into education, trying to get them into our neediest areas is a big challenge. They want to go to larger places if they want to stay in the state. So how do we encourage more people to go into not just the Delta, but other rural places across the state of Mississippi? Another big challenge is around the way we...
Aside from your own recruitment efforts, I'm
doing all that I can. Look, I'm doing everything that I can. Yeah. I think that there needs to be a bigger focus within our schools of education around the specific training that you need in order to be successful as a teacher in rural places in Mississippi. Especially when you're talking about educating low-income children, when you're talking about educating black children, when you're talking about children who are grade levels behind and you're trying to catch them up. I think there should also be special training for people who are interested in leading schools in these communities. So we need to think more broadly about what principals need in order to go into these schools and be successful on day one. I think there's another big issue around the way we finance our schools. We have a funding formula in Mississippi that is not equitable. It was established back in 1997, back when I was a high school junior. Michael Jordan was still playing. And we had a funding formula that was based on adequacy. It did a really good job of addressing the needs of adequacy, setting that floor, like this is the basic amount of money. Now, we don't fund that funding formula fully every year, but at least we established what the floor is. Now that we know a lot more about what it takes to actually fund education, we know that we need to be focused more on equity. Our low-income students need a lot more. Our special education students need a lot more. Our ELL students need a lot more. Gifted students, high school students, all these students, we know how much more money they need in order to get the education that they need. And we're going to have those conversations in Mississippi about how do we fix our formula to make it more equitable. However, in order to have those conversations, we need to be able to address revenue. And in a beat red state like Mississippi, it's tough to talk about revenue. And we also need to talk about equity between some of our high wealth districts versus some of our more impoverished districts. And a lot of these high wealth districts are getting a lot more state money than they really deserve. And that keeps us from being able to provide enough money for our low income students, ELL students. So that's going to be a very difficult conversation
I would
to have
say
in
so,
Mississippi.
yeah. You're flipping the existing sort of hierarchy.
Yeah. I mean, it's a conversation that is long overdue.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Others on that point, the biggest obstacles to students in your respective domains being successful?
I mean, it's interesting because where I'm at, and generally in rural Kentucky, we have some hard to fill positions that I think generally, are across America, like your high school chemistry or your special ed teachers. But generally, the teaching positions are highly coveted. You have people who have their master's plus 60 credits teaching. And when you look at the outcomes, K-8, generally students in Kentucky perform on average as the United States, despite, poverty levels that are, the worst in America. But it all falls apart in high school and then in educational attainment. And so I know we don't want to start talking about college and post-secondary, but really I think the biggest challenge that in rural Kentucky is really how to get those kids to persist through high school and beyond high school. That is the number one challenge. I think that the teachers generally in the schools do a phenomenal job educating the students, elementary, middle, and junior high, and then something happens at that high school. What's
that something? What gets in the way?
There's no, I mean, if you try to encourage someone to go to college and you provide all these supports, if that person and that family, they know that as soon as that kid goes to college, he's not coming back. So, how fair is it to say, see ya? Do we do that to people in metropolitan communities? No, we don't. But we do it in rural America. We just say, well, sorry, you're going to have to leave your community and never come back. And there might be a chance, some lottery position might open where your degree matches that position back in your community and you can go back and live in that community. So there's a big misalignment between positions and jobs and economic opportunity and the educational system that we currently have. And, it's been decades in the making, and I think that's what I see as the biggest challenge.
Fair enough. Good. Mara.
I would agree with both of those, the financial piece and the higher education piece, and really that thorny issue around what happens after getting a degree and being able to get kids back. The other issue I would name is school closure. And so in the past 10 to 15 years, 35 of our states have either adopted or considered adopting legislation that either incentivized or mandated school closure. So we've been closing schools, and there's been a lot of high-profile urban closures as well. And I think we need to begin to think about these kinds of urban and rural closures actually as connected rather than like disparate phenomenon. But we've actually been closing rural schools really since we began having a public education system. So we've been closing rural schools for the past 150 years. I mean, if you're driving the rural roads, every time you hit a different town, every one of those towns at one point had a school, right? And most of them do not have schools anymore. And when schools close, there's been some really good research recently, mostly in urban closures, kids don't get any better education by the new school they're going to, and also because of that close relationship between rural schools and rural communities. When a rural school closes, that's going to have all kinds of impacts on that community. So it's mind-boggling to me that many policymakers right now are talking about how do we revitalize rural communities, and they're still adopting legislation closing rural schools. And so that, to me, I think is one of the biggest challenges that we need to be thinking about, the whole closures of school, and also beginning to think about aligning our educational policies with some of our other policies as well.
Let's shift gears a little bit to talking about higher education, in particular adult education. We hear a lot of talk about what needs to happen in rural communities in terms of human capital development in order to provide people who aren't working with a viable income, and in order to develop businesses in those communities is retraining people who've been in other industries like coal, for example, and those jobs have gone away, and retraining folks to do other jobs. Are the opportunities there? Is this happening to the degree that it should be happening? What are the obstacles? What are the needs to do a better job on adult education in particular in rural communities?
Well, I'd like to speak to that. I mean, yes, there's tremendous opportunity, especially in the skilled trades. There's if you look at the average age of a plumber in the United States is like 63. So, there's going to be opportunities now. Are those scalable opportunities in rural communities? Maybe not, but that's at least some, opportunity there. And just generally in terms of retraining and reskilling, adults who've been put out of work because of the decline in coal, no, there's not enough investment. The investment has been paltry, scattered, and wrong-minded. And I could say a few other words, but I'll stop there. We need to actually, if we wanted to retrain people in rural America, we could do it. And there are some promising, for example, at Pine Mountain, we had a out-of-work coal miner. He'd been working in the coal mine since he was for 23 years, since he was 17. He didn't see any purpose in going to college because he could go out of high school and make $75,000, $80,000 a year. He worked there his whole life, had 2 kids, a mortgage, everything. And, of course, Trump said that everyone would keep their job. And what happened just, about 6 months ago, he got laid off. Complete desperation, didn't know how they're going to put food on the table. There's a training program offered by the local community college that paid him to come and work at Pine Mountain, a living wage, and go to school and earn his HVAC certification. There is a job at the end of the pipeline. Well, what happened? 6 months into that program, into that 18-month program, funding stopped. And so now he's 6 months into this program with a certification that is worthless, or half a certification. Right. And he's now thinking, gosh, I got to go back to this coal mine that laid me off and hired a bunch of inexperienced miners and paid them $10 an hour. It's dangerous. Well, it's dangerous to begin with, and it's even more dangerous when you have inexperienced people in there. And, and of course, the toll it takes on your body. So how does that happen? I don't understand why stuff like that happens, and I'm sure you all can talk to experiences like that, but to me that is so frustrating when you have a program that works and you have people that are benefiting from it, and then the funding just gets stripped away.
So it's a policy challenge.
I think it's political will. I think that right now our country's benefiting from polarization, and I blame politicians, generally, all of them.
Don't hold back. Mara, comment on this. I know you've written about things like dual enrollment. You've talked about the debt that some older students are incurring in terms of trying to finance education. What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I think the higher education piece is challenging. I mean, just for a little bit of context, rural students don't go to college at the same rates as their urban and suburban counterparts. And when they do go to college, they are overrepresented in 2-year degrees, underrepresented in 4-year degrees, and really underrepresented in selective 4-year institutions. So this college-going piece is a real challenge. There are, I think, a number of issues that are kind of feeding into those uneven rates. rates, on inadequate preparation, the distance from home. There's been some really interesting work looking at education deserts across the country, and guess what? Most of those are in rural areas. So the costs, the social costs for going to college are just higher for rural students, for rural families. They've got to go farther. And so that can be a real a burden on a rural family. And then college costs, I think, right now are, astronomical in taking on that kind of debt. But I think there are some promising things happening right now. There have been some really interesting programs that are bringing cohorts of students together to institutions of higher education, and that cohort model seems to really hold some promise. Dual enrollment, I think, is another area that's really promising right now, particularly the models where many rural communities do actually have close access to community colleges. So if students can actually not have the college instructor come to the high school, but to get the high schoolers going to the college, they can really begin to understand what that college environment is like, begin to see themselves as a college student. So I think that can help with some of the preparation issues. In terms of adults going to, so kind of quote unquote non-traditional students, older adults in their 30s and 40s, like the adult that Geoff mentioned. I think there are some promising programs there as well. I think the political will is really the bigger challenge there. I recently read something that the fastest growing sector in terms of student debt is like the age 45 to 65 or something like that. And I mean, these are adults that, like the guy that Geoff mentioned, I mean, they're doing exactly what they were told, right? Which is their rural industry where they've been working is declining. They go, they get that degree, they're trying to put that to work, and they're taking on massive debt. And so, again, I think the political will is perhaps the biggest challenge here.
Good, fair enough. Sanford.
There's an additional need to provide support for parents who are in schools.
Yeah.
I say that as somebody who's done a lot of work around teen health and sex education in Mississippi, as well as serving on the board of this small nonprofit in my community that provides scholarships to single parents who are trying to complete their degree. And they can use this money to pay rent when they need to pay rent. They can use it for gas. If they need to get their car fixed, they can do that. They can also do it for childcare. And as we've been working with these parents over the past couple of years, there are some major policy changes that need to take place to better support parents who are trying to finish their college degrees. Not just in terms of just being able to provide more economic support, but there also need to be some changes that take place on college campuses. And how do we make our colleges more friendly so that a single parent, a single mom or a single dad can actually complete their degree? How flexible are we being with classes? Are we providing that flexibility? Is there childcare on campus that students can take advantage of? So I think that's a real opportunity for one of you to come down to the Delta and help us figure out how are we going to solve this problem. Recruitment pitch number 4.
Tom, you have talked in the work that you're going to be doing. You're going to be looking at the transition from high school to college, and I wonder what you've seen out there that's promising.
So there was a really interesting program in the state of Michigan where they identified students around the state that looked like they had PSAT scores and high school grades that would have made them eligible to go to the University of Michigan. And they learned something really important, and that was the students in the rural schools were the ones who were feeling the greatest chasm between them and the University of Michigan. They were the students who were having the hardest time seeing themselves at the University of Michigan. And the way they learned that was they sent out flyers to the students that met this profile, but not all the kids. They sent out these flyers to a subset of kids and used the others to say, okay, well, let's see what impact we can have on college-going rates. And they discovered that in the packet it was a letter that said, congratulations, based on your test scores and high school grades, you look like you'd be perfect for the University of Michigan. Apply, and we'll provide you with a scholarship to go. And just that simple outreach had a huge impact on the proportion of kids in the rural schools deciding to apply to the University of Michigan. Now, I realize that's just a subset of the problem. These are the kids who are finishing high school with really strong records. But that is some low-hanging fruit that flagship universities in lots of states could just do a better job reaching out to kids in rural communities, and they're used to being overwhelmed with applications, and so they're not in the habit of reaching out as much as they should. And so, but a little bit of outreach, even a simple thing like sending out these congratulations notes could be a way to help more kids not undermatch, not go to the local community college because that's the easy thing to do, but to go to the college where their completion rates are going to be much higher.
Let's flip to the other end of the age spectrum, just in case. Any comments on early childhood and access to early childhood education? We know what a difference that makes in terms of return on investment.
So I think Mississippi could be a model for how we do early childhood education in rural states. When we first started this work, there was a lot of tension between school districts and Head Start over the 4-year-olds. And of course, school districts wanted to have pre-K. Head Start did not want to lose their 4-year-olds. There was came up with this collaborative delivery model by which school districts, Head Start, private child care centers would work together and create a community plan on how we're going to serve the 4-year-olds in a community. You'll have a lead partner, usually a school district, that will provide professional development. You'll have teachers that will split their time. Maybe they'll spend the morning at the school district, the afternoon at a Head Start center, or maybe the morning in the Head Start center, afternoon in the child care center. But it's a community plan on how you serve pre-K. It was done as a competitive grant process. So there was a certain amount of money that the state put up, and you apply, you get your collaborative together, you apply for the money. If you get it, you get to start a collaborative. It's very small right now, so it only serves like 10% of the 4-year-olds, but it's produced amazing results. We've seen folks who've gone through pre-K have, like, kindergarten readiness is up at 70% right now, which is a major improvement from where we were before we started pre-K. And I think as long as we expand that program, then we'll see even better results. One thing that we have to do first is make sure, because the way the program is set up, it's set up with a 50-50 match where the state puts in half the money and then the local collaborative puts in half, which they can do in terms of, like, you're providing facilities. You can also do donations. There's a tax credit that people are able to participate in. And we've realized that in order to run a high-quality pre-K classroom, it costs $100,000 per classroom. And right now they're funded at $86,000. So we need the state to put in more money because right now that money is being covered by the local collaborative. So that's going to be our big campaign push over the future. But I think not only can it be a model for how we do pre-K, but I think it can also be a model for how we handle CTE. It could be a model for how we handle special education. Can we get districts to work together? And maybe we're not consolidating, but we're using like shared use agreements where we're actually collaborating on how we're sharing resources. So I'm hoping that this will be a model that will take off, and I'm hoping that our legislators in Mississippi will actually see that this is a major return on investment and that eventually we'll have a collaborative in every county in the state of Mississippi.
I want to come to the topic of innovation. And for a lot of people, the subject of innovation is synonymous with technology, which may or may not be a correct way to think about it. But I know a lot of people have thought that bringing more technology, and some of you have mentioned it, Sanford, with your comment on broadband and so forth, to these communities makes a big difference. Tell us about what you think the likely contribution is, or a desired contribution of technology to improving effective education and development of human capital in your communities.
I think my concern would be technology is good in addition to having great teachers. it cannot be something that we do instead of having great teachers. What we're seeing in a lot of districts in the Delta is that because you can't fill all the teaching spots with a certified teacher, you'll end up providing it as an online class, which, if you don't have somebody in the classroom that can provide the additional help for students that need the additional help, then you have students that are lost, and it's a lost opportunity. So that's what I'm really concerned about in terms of being able to provide online education. But also, we come back to this rural broadband issue. We need to make sure that now that we have this new opportunity, that our electric power companies are actually providing broadband everywhere. And then once we have that, then we need to make sure that we're providing online classes in a way that it's actually a benefit to rural students.
There's two things that I think are particularly promising when it comes to technology, with, again, the caveat that we need broadband access, high-quality broadband access to really do anything. One is professional development for teachers, and so being able to use online or remote technologies in order to be able to get teachers that kind of professional development. Again, I think it needs to be done as an add-on, and so we know that the best professional development actually happens in school buildings. And so, are there ways to kind of blend coaching models, but then there's kind of sustained contact through some of these remote technologies? So that's one promising area. A second one is in terms of working with particularly adults or non-traditional students that are getting degrees. Because of ties to family and responsibilities at home, it can be really challenging to go to a campus. And so the University of Maine, for example, it has a large population of students that are about the ages of, like, middle 30s, middle 40s, and they have families. And so they are going back, getting a degree. A lot of that work is online, but they do a lot of it at regional centers. So they actually have a cohort of students that are actually working together to be able to work on their degree, and they have an instructor from the university that's there supporting them. So again, this is a kind of a blended model. One big worry I have with technology is as it relates to charter schools. So charter schools have been expanding in a number of states, and a lot of rural areas are now seeing charter schools. My concern is around virtual charter schools, which we know on the whole their results aren't nearly as good as brick and mortar charter schools or brick and mortar traditional schools. And so my concern is that with the push towards choice right now, we're going to see virtual charter schools as the choice for rural communities when we know that that is a subpar choice. So that's kind of like one big concern I have on the horizon when it comes to technology and rural education.
Good, thank you. Tom, did you want to weigh in on that?
As you said, innovation isn't just about technology. Right. And what we're trying to do with this National Center for Rural Education Research Networks is to make it possible for rural schools to do innovation. So here's one thing that we've been working with a group of urban districts learned. It's not technology, but it's a simple thing that made a big difference, and that was just having kindergarten and first grade teachers send a postcard home when a child has missed school, just reporting what was the content that they taught that day. It's a simple thing. Just saying, today was the day we covered the letter S. And so a parent would see, oh gosh, my kid's name is Sanford, if he is he going to spend the rest of his life, not knowing how to spell his name? Just doing that. That didn't happen. No. So just doing that lowered absence rates by 15%. So, and now these districts are scaling it up. I mean, that will be the kind, not just the postcards, but imagine that applied to lots of things like school start times or teacher professional development or other kinds of things that rural schools can now start to try out new solutions to old problems and learn, whether or not they're working before they decide to scale it up.
Where does the political will come come from on these kinds of policy changes you've proposed, or investment opportunities or changes in school finance formulas as it comes to rural America? Where do you see the political will coming from on these issues?
It's a good question.
I'm looking for the answer.
I don't know.
Well, I mean, the rural conversation has shifted more centrally. In other words, we're talking about it. A lot of people subsequent to the 2016 election are talking about it. But how do you turn that sort of rekindled energy, if you will, into positive momentum to some of the kinds of changes that you've been prescribing?
If I've learned nothing else from 2016, I think I learned that you have to be engaged. Because if you're not engaged, somebody will get elected. Somebody will be in that position. And if you're not there to help influence those decisions, somebody else will. And it's not just at the national level, but it even starts at your local school district. Like, how many parents actually take the time to go to their local school district and find out what policy decisions are being made in your community, in the schools that you send your kids to? So in order to find the political will, I think everybody's going to just have to get more engaged. I think we're going to have to hold elected officials more accountable, not just our school board members, but our state representatives. Like, if you keep talking about school funding, you need to do something about school funding. And if you don't do something about school funding, you need to be able to call that person and say, why haven't you done anything around school funding? And I think once elected officials start realizing that if we don't make these policy decisions, then we're going to hear from our people back at home, then I think folks will start finding the political will. But right now, I think in a lot of places in Mississippi, people feel like I can make these decisions and I know there'll be no political consequence for it.
I also think part of the political will comes from having more rural folks at the policymaking table. And I think that it needs to be a diverse array of rural folks at the policymaking table, particularly communities that have been historically marginalized. And because I think there is new energy on kind of the policymaking front around rural communities, and some of the decisions that are getting made are just not very wise. And so if people are actually listening to rural folks, and I think that's where part of that political will is going to come from.
The Education Redesign Lab, we do a lot of work bringing together sort of collective impact or collaborative action mechanisms called children's cabinets. Everybody in a community who has an interest or runs an organization that's connected with children coming together and thinking about how to set goals for children's well-being and development and strategies and how to measure progress and hold themselves accountable. As we've sort of touched in very tentatively to rural communities, one of the things that we see there as a great asset is the quality of relationships between people. The long-standing relationships, being in kind of permanent relationship, people know who one another are and they know they're going to be living together indefinitely, and they have a sense of responsibility and ownership that we frequently find missing in sort of more anonymous kinds of urban settings. I wonder what you see as the sort of challenges and opportunities in the way of collaborative action in rural communities, standing up for themselves, putting together new solutions to persistent problems and things of that nature.
I'm the chair of the Harlan County Industrial Development Authority. I'm also the president of the Harlan County Chamber of Commerce. I mean, people in rural communities, they all wear like 7 different hats, and it's completely relationally based. The organization doesn't matter, the person matters. The challenge is when you have someone who's in a position of power in an organization and they, for various reasons, don't have the capacity or are challenging to work with, and then you end up creating workarounds around that person, which then multiplies organizations or other relationships. I mean, you have the same problem here in Cambridge, I think. I worked on some volunteer work here, and I remember there was like 26 different organizations working around children's issues in Cambridge, which is great, but also can be challenging. But I do think it's easier in rural communities. this idea of collective impact, I think that was invented in rural communities.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you.
I'm the incoming Rotary president in Clarksville. I got you there. One unique part about communities, not just in the Delta, but in other parts of Mississippi, is that there are two separate education conversations that are taking place. There's the black folks conversation, and then there's the white folks conversation, because the black citizens are in the public schools, and then the white people go to the private school. And there have been several times in my life where I found myself talking to people on both sides of the tracks about education. And what's amazing is that the exact same conversation is taking place. I'm not happy with the school that I have right now. I wish our leadership would do something to fix it. I don't feel like my child is prepared. And it's just amazing that the exact same conversation is taking place in both sides. And it's so difficult to get everybody together. And I keep thinking, if we were all to come together and start having these conversations together, what could education actually look like? How can we actually have some collective power to solve these issues? There have been moments in Clarksville, using my community as an example, where we've been able to do amazing things. Like, we built a Kaboom playground where everybody participated. Our blues festivals are amazing and completely diverse. But if we could take these opportunities into how do we fix education? How do we improve opportunities for kids? We could do amazing things. But first, we need to tear down this wall and start having the same conversation together.
Great. Okay, I'm going to ask one last question to our panel, and so I'd encourage those of you who are so inclined to think about questions you might have, and feel free to approach the microphones. But let's assume you had a group of policymakers in the audience, which you have some here tonight. What would be your top priority suggestions? And a number of you have been critical about policies that currently stand. You've indicated some things that are important to you. What would be your top couple of suggestions you'd make to the policy community, both at the state level and at the federal level, in terms of what they should stop doing and what they should start doing relative to promoting the health and well-being of rural America?
Who's going to take that one first? Go for it. Go for it.
So many. So a couple I would say is the funding piece. And this is something that is not specific to rural communities, but this hits urban communities as well, but fairly funding our schools. I think that's probably priority number one. Number two for me would be school closures. Particularly if we're serious about really revitalizing rural schools, rural communities, we can't be closing rural schools. And I guess maybe the third is less a particular policy and more an approach to policy making is this issue of coordination, and really trying to coordinate educational policy with economic policy, with policies around infrastructure and healthcare. We cannot just be thinking about these things in silos. If we really want to support rural communities, we've got to be working on all fronts.
Thank you, Mark.
I promise I wasn't lying when I said that I was going to try to recruit every last one of you. I'm so serious about that, because our biggest issue is around capacity. Our biggest issue is capacity. Like, we need superintendents, we need principals, we need after-school programs, we need people working in education, we need people that are working in healthcare. And what we're trying to do in Mississippi is try to grow our own as much as possible, but we have lost so much talent. I really think about it a lot when I go to national conferences. There's one in particular. There's this conference called Education Leaders of Color, EDLOC. And I go to that conference every year. It's African Americans, Latinos, all together. We're having conversations about education. Every time I go to this conference, I meet people who either grew up in Mississippi, or their parents grew up in Mississippi, or their grandparents grew up in Mississippi. And of course, I do the pitch, because that's what I do. And it's really challenging to talk to somebody who feels like their family escaped Mississippi, because it's really hard to try to recruit somebody to come back to a place that their family feel like they escaped from. So trying to change that mindset, trying to change the narrative and tell people that there are good things going on here, and we just need like you to be a part of this team, like that is my number one thing. So let's do the research. Please do the research. please figure out like what are some ways that we can improve the quality of education in rural places. But we really need some of y'all to just bring all your stuff, just come down. You can live like a rapper on a teacher's salary. You can have like columns in front of your house. Like, I'm really trying to sell you hard on this because like capacity building is one of our biggest challenges. So y'all come on, talk to me afterwards. We'll talk about some opportunities.
All right. Thank you, Sam.
I mean, it's pretty simple. Put more money in the hands of people who live and work in rural communities. That's it. And I can't pass up this opportunity to tell a little story and kind of tease Tom a little bit. So a friend of mine saw the announcement that Harvard got this $10 million grant to study rural schools, and I think this is an awesome project, by the way. And he said to me, "Hey, you went to Harvard? You have all these connections. You think we're going to see any of that money?" And, and I looked at it and I'm like, yeah, it's probably not going to make it to Harlan County. And it shouldn't, not those particular funds, but there are 10 times, 100 times that amount of funding that their research center got that just gets filtered and wasted through levels of bureaucracy at the federal and the state level. And I can tell you 100 different stories on how that happens, and it trickles down in the form of technical assistance or, micro grants, and these are multi-million-dollar grants and funding that are intended to go to help people in rural communities. And there already are organizations and people in rural America doing amazing work. We all know that. Why aren't those organizations and people getting the money? So policymakers, send money to me, send money to Mara, send money to Sanford. We will take it and we will put it to good use.
Yes.
And let us keep.
Yes, sir. Give them a little bit more money, too.
So Tom, you can close us out. You've got some money. You're looking at you're looking at some key junctures. What do you hope to learn, and how do you think that might influence policy going forward?
So, as I said at the beginning, I really do think that one of the primary challenges that K-12 education faces, not just rural districts, but urban districts too, is just how to improve. People have been doing things the same way for decades, and it's partially because it's hard to figure out whether some new idea actually works and to feel like you have an opportunity to try some new things out and see whether it works. And so I really do hope that that if we can figure out how to make it easier for rural schools to pilot and test things and find things that work, that will make a much bigger difference 20 years from now than almost any single policy proposal in vogue today, and so that's what we're going to be doing, starting in New York and Ohio, but hopefully then developing a model that could be applied to lots of other states. Because people like me, Paul, you mentioned our research center has been working with school districts and state agencies, and we've been doing this kind of work, helping school districts use their data to try to pilot and test, policies. And we and almost everybody else who does the kind of work I do have been ignoring rural schools, and I hope that we can come up with the model that others can copy that will help change that.
Okay, thank you. All right, I don't see anybody at the microphones. I'm perfectly prepared to keep asking questions. All right, now we got some movement here. Please identify yourself and, again, frame a question, if you will. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so my name is Brian Johnson. I'm a staff member at CEPR. And I guess...
Is this a plant, Tom?
I don't know. I don't think so.
So I remember hearing probably a couple years ago a story on NPR about Mr. Marietta. I'm thinking of the story that you told about people who have been laid off. They went to a job retraining program in HVAC. And the program that was funded, they weren't cut off, so they all finished it successfully. But then the local job market in their area that had just lost its primary industry was then glutted with people who had HVAC certifications, and they couldn't find jobs because all of their former coworkers had the same credential. So I guess, how do you, in terms of education policy, but I guess other things coupled with education policy, how do you incentivize businesses to want to locate those high-paying opportunities, diverse opportunities in the first place in local, in rural areas?
You know, I don't want to get political, but what if we cut all payroll taxes for any business that moved into a rural area that had triple the unemployment rate of the national average? And I guarantee you that that wouldn't make that big of a dent on the payroll taxes for the state, because these are depressed areas already. How much payroll tax are they actually getting out of some of these communities? There are super reasonable policies, and that sounds like a terrible training program, by the way, to not responsive to the local community. But, you know, there are some very, very simple things that if there was, again, the political will, I think you could see, you know, economic freedom zones or non-tax zones or whatever in not only in rural but in urban. And they try to do this with the Opportunity Zone. Have people heard about the Opportunity Zone? Mm-hmm. Completely politically hijacked. Did not actually identify and go to. It may have in some states because it was often state by state. But you know, we need to remove some of the politicization from economic development and education in America.
Okay, thank you. Let's go over here.
Hi, my name is Kelly Organ. I'm a student here. More importantly, I'm from a small town in northern Iowa, so I'm very, very happy to hear HGSE finally talking about rural education. My question is about school closure and school consolidation, which, Mara, you've spoken against a few times. You spoke really poignantly about the importance and the intentionality that a lot of people who live in small towns have about shopping locally, about not shopping on Amazon, whatever, to support local businesses. And a lot of those same people then turn and look at their local schools and say, well, look, the bigger school in the city, half an hour away, or an hour or 2 hours away in my case, has a robotics program. My kid's into robots. Like, I'm going to send them there. And particularly in states like Indiana, who have really made it very accessible to get a voucher to send your student anywhere they want to go, that's led to a lot of drainage of these like itty-bitty schools. And for students with special needs, English language learners, whatever, a lot of these tiny little schools just aren't able to provide the specialized support services their students deserve. So I'm curious, knowing the values you hold of trying to keep these schools alive, but also provide really high quality services to to individual students, if you've seen any good practices around this challenge.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great question, Kelly. So I think the first thing I'll just point out is that's really a question of scarcity, right? And so maybe if we funded our schools better, we wouldn't have to make those kinds of choices. So I think that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I would say is that I think some of these cooperative agreements that can exist between districts where you're sharing services can be really useful in terms of being able to provide those kinds of more specialized programs or services that all students need. The trick becomes it requires a high level of trust between districts, and the consolidation landscape has been created in a way that's really pitted districts against one another. So that's a political challenge, being able to kind of build that sort of trust. And we just can't do that when there are such like kind of looming threats when it comes to policies around consolidation and closure. So I think also if we release, like some states actually have like mandates that, you know, minimum enrollments, things like that, or building mandates that are leading to consolidation right now, and it's creating this environment of feeling of competition and stress. So I think if we eliminate some of those, districts will be more willing to enter into those kinds of sharing of services that will allow schools to specialize a bit, stay open, have the kinds of transportation contracts that would require that would facilitate that. I don't know if others have thoughts on that. Or
Thank you. I'm going to keep it moving just because I want to get as many people the opportunity as possible. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Nathan. I'm from the great state of Arkansas. I am a career math teacher and intend to be. And part of what I hear in this forum is, as a teacher, there's a part of me that gets anxious when I hear, for example, there's a study that is about to be engaged upon, and I think about some of the best PD I had, some of the best knowledge I get from teachers is actually from other teachers, and how the system is inherently rigged that it does not necessarily give that credence to the historical lessons that these teachers have learned and carry with them. That doesn't get necessarily projected or explained through the data that you would see. So what I see then is, well, how will we be engaging in these studies with teachers who come and have been teaching for 30 plus years in the Mississippi Delta and can give you tons of information about how students learn and how they succeed, and would laugh at these studies because they're saying, no, this anecdotal data that I have is frowned upon in the academy because the academy wants data, the academy wants numbers, but the anecdotes are what has literally carried these communities, specifically African American communities in the South. And so hearing these studies, there's this anxiousness that builds up in me, both as a math teacher, but also as a career teacher who wishes to go back to the Mississippi Delta, and wondering how will you engage with that with fidelity, such that as I sit in my classroom, I'm not going to see this study and think, well, here's another person who has taught maybe for 2, 3 years, 4 years, but you're not in the classroom, and I know that this teacher down the hall for 30 plus years can tell me better how students succeed at least in my town, than what you will find in Ohio or New York.
Fair enough. Good question. Tom?
So I wanted to, that is a good question, because I have seen many of my colleagues working with school districts, often urban districts, where the colleague shows up at the district with an intervention that they want to try, that they then talk the school district into doing. That's not what we're doing. So what we're doing is we are basically just trying to be a teammate, where we're saying, look, we've got the data analytics skills. You guys pick the interventions you want to try, and we'll just be the number crunchers for you. We'll help you figure this out. So for instance, in the case of a teacher's knowledge that they've developed over their career, I mean, actually, I think that's a perfect example of where there is innovation going on all the time. It's just that we never test it. Like, teachers have developed their own materials, and and it just retires with them. So if some of these districts wanted to make it easier for teachers to share videos of their lessons, find the teacher who's teaching, Algebra 1 and getting terrific results, and say, okay, could we videotape some of your lessons and share it with other teachers? That would be the kind of thing that if a district wanted to try that, not us, if the district wanted to try that, we would set it up in a way that they could figure out whether doing that, improves student achievement.
We're almost out of time, and I want to try and get a couple of other people to the microphone. Quick question, if you would, sir.
Yes, my name is Bob Rosenfeld. I'm a fellow in the Advanced Leadership Initiative here. I wanted to talk about one other component of the urban-rural divide. You've talked about the quality gap. We also have an understanding gap between urban and rural. And Geoff, we've talked about this, and your notion of studying abroad in eastern Kentucky obviously resonated with our conversation. I'm curious what ideas you all might have about how we begin to bridge that gap in perception and understanding between urban and rural communities.
Thank you.
I think this is a really important point. I've begun to think more, I think part of it is the way we talk. And we talk about the two as if they are opposites from one another, right? And I began to think a lot more about spatial inequality and about the uneven distribution of resources across geography. And that is something that disadvantages, it tends to overlap with race and class. And it disadvantages a lot of rural communities and a lot of urban communities. So I think partly this is a narrative issue where we need to talk differently about rural. And it's not rural versus urban. We need to think about what is the distribution of resources across geography, and then what are the ways in which policies like school closure policies are actually affecting both rural and urban places. And so I think partly it's a frame of reference shift, and then also building a cross geography movement for educational justice. That's not just about rural education or urban education, but that's really looking at what does it mean to have a fair and just education for all children.
Thank you. Let's quickly shift over here.
Yeah, quickly, I'm Casey, and I am an accidental educator, was an economist, and I'm also recruiting for Hawaii. So I want to ask you about learning styles, because I don't know. I taught mostly Hawaiian, Polynesian, local kids from plantations, but their learning styles was kinetic. It was hands-on, and so their knowledge of the land, of the weather, of the movement of the winds was better than the guys from NOAA. The water, the stream, they could tell by looking at it was polluted, but they were failing science. I had to give them GoPros, things like that. Our music, our dance, our storytelling, also that's because of Hawaiian, but I didn't know of Appalachia. Children that I told was stupid, they could go home, they would write a whole music score. Beautiful. They had been told they were stupid. So I want to know about learning styles, and is there a different in other rural, is this a rural learning style that's different, and is there work on that? And of course, my biggest problems was homelessness was growing. The Airbnb I had coming in and throwing out more and more people, over 20 kids, and I taught, and their families who worked were homeless, and the corruption. I know that you're talking about the great things about the rural, but I love bringing in grants. I'm really good at it. But I couldn't handle the corruption. So-and-so is related to so-and-so. My film equipment would go for their weddings, their GoFundMes, because so-and-so needed it. And,
Let's focus on your professional development.
So those are the things.
In the interest of time.
Yeah, the learning style and the negative.
Right. Sanford, you mentioned earlier that you think special training is indicated, and I wonder if you'd respond to that.
Yes. And what I would say is that no matter where you're going to teach, I think you really need to understand the place that you're going to be teaching in, really understand the community, understand the history, understand the culture. If you're going to come teach in the Mississippi Delta, then you've got to understand that we influenced all of your favorite musicians. So you need to keep that in mind. Also, and I say this as a former social studies teacher, one of the greatest human rights movements to ever take place in the history of the world took place in our backyard. Like, Aaron E. Henry, was in Clarksdale. Fannie Lou Hamer was 30 minutes away from where we are right now. If you're going to teach social studies, you must include that history within your curriculum, no matter what you do. Also, in terms of an additional challenge, and I say this as somebody who's a member of the Mississippi Sex Ed training cadre, we have started doing trainings around trauma. And there is an amazing amount of trauma that our students face, and we've seen this in just a small area of just teachers who are going to be doing sex ed. And we keep thinking about how do we expand this so that all teachers are thinking about, instead of saying what's wrong with this kid, what happened to that kid? Because some of the problems and some of the challenges that our kids bring to school every morning, it's just amazing. So we need to be more thoughtful about how we address that as teachers.
Okay, last question.
My name is Braden Foldenauer. I'm at the college, and as a Mississippi native, I appreciate all the recruitment. But that said, my question is, especially considering the limited funds that we have, how do you incentivize teachers to come to a rural area other than just making it this sort of noble self-sacrifice? Is there a way that we can draw teachers in rather than, talk about this savior complex and stuff? So is there another way that maybe we can appeal teachers to our region?
I think one of the key things is we have to have good principals. That's one thing. Nobody wants to work for a bad principal. So folks need to have the confidence of knowing that I can go into this community. I'm going to be with a good team. I'm going to be with a leader who's going to develop me as a teacher, and we're going to be able to produce great results. I also think that we need to attract people who really want to challenge. there are so many people who are, doing innovative things in some of the larger cities. Like everybody's going to New York, everybody's going to DC, everybody's going to Chicago. But if you really want a challenge, you need to come to a place like Humphreys County, Holmes County, Clarksdale, Cleveland. And with a small amount of effort, you can produce amazing results. Like when I think about what we've done in pre-K in Mississippi, like we were able to do something great on a state level with just a small amount of resources. So just think what we could do if we had a larger investment. And it would be hard to do the work that we're doing around creating an education policy nonprofit. It'd be hard to do this work if we went to DC, because there are several other organizations doing that. There are several organizations doing this in Boston. There are several organizations doing this in Oakland. But there's only one ed policy organization in Mississippi. So come to Mississippi, build something, and you can produce great results.
Sadly, we're out of time. So I want to ask you, this has been an incredibly thoughtful, committed, impressive panel of activists on this topic, and we're privileged to have you all with us. Please join me in thanking our panelists.